Thank you, Dean Davis. Thank you, George. And thanks to all of you for being here. We are pleased and honored to spend this time with you today. I'd like to just start quickly with a story about my daughter. A couple of years ago, she was 9 years old, and we were in the car, and I said to her, "Hey, honey, did you know that our national debt is $19 trillion? She loves being in the car with me. And she said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah. And guess who's going to have to pay that back?" Now she's horrified in her face. And she says, "You? Oh, so cute, but no, that's not how it works. You're going to have to pay that back." And she turned and said, "Me? What did I ever do?" So, as you can see from these conversations that I force upon my daughter in the car, I care deeply about politics, policy, and the trajectory of the country. And Michael and I do this work together because we are both concerned about that trajectory and the failure of Washington, D.C. to deal with any of our most critical problems. Now, there's so much talk all the time today about hyperpartisanship and all the division in the country. So I want to start with one thing on which absolutely everybody does agree. Washington is broken. Washington is broken. We say it all the time. And yet, as my good friend, former Congressman Mickey Edwards, first realized, this statement reflects a profound misunderstanding of the true problem. In fact, Washington is working exactly how it's designed to work and delivering exactly what it's designed to deliver. Rational question, how can the political system be so perfectly designed and yet deliver such dismal results? And the answer is that it's simply not designed for us. In fact, the system has been custom designed, maintained, fine-tuned over a long period of time by and for the benefit of two private gain-seeking organizations. These are our major political parties and their industry allies, what together comprise what we call the political industrial complex. And this duopoly is fundamentally the only constituency that matters. So I'm going to look for the clicker and move to a Venn diagram that really, in a simple way, encapsulates the current problem. There is currently virtually no intersection between Congress acting in the public interest and the likelihood of their being reelected. So in other words, if America's representatives do their jobs the way we need them to, they're likely to lose those jobs. So let's think about that. Fortunately, we can fix this. In 2016, I asked Michael to join me on a new approach to our political problem using this lens of competition thinking and industry analysis that he pioneered to understand competition in other industries. And using these tools to look at politics sheds new light on the failures, because politics has become a major industry that functions like other industries. And as the dean said, our problems are not attributable to a single factor, but rather to a failure of the nature of the competition that's been created. This is a systems problem. Michael and I were very clear right from the start that the last thing we wanted to do was simply add to the depressing commentary about politics, but rather to endeavor to figure out what it would take precisely to change the system, not for change's sake, but in order to change the results that the system regularly delivers. Please note that when we talk today, it's about politics, but it's not political. Michael's a Massachusetts Republican. I used to be a Democrat. Before that was Libertarian. Now I'm a centrist independent, sort of kind of covering everything here. And the problem is not Democrats or Republicans or even the existence of parties per se. The problem is this nature of competition. So first, Michael's going to tell you what's at stake, and then I'll come back and tell you why everything's screwed up, who's to blame, and most importantly, how we can fix it. Michael.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I think that introduction hopefully gets us started down the path that we have to understand if we are going to actually change the trajectory of our political system, which I think we're all going to understand is really now imperative. As you know, I'm a strategy professor, but also an economist working on economic development. And I can tell you that a few years ago, politics was literally the last thing I thought I would ever work on. This was not what I did. But that changed. And it actually changed because of Catherine, who helped me understand that this is so much at stake in terms of our country's future, then we can't not look at this. We can't ignore it. So in 2010, I began co-chairing a multi-year project at HBS, the U.S. Competitiveness Project. We at the school decided that we would try to do deep research to understand America's disturbing economic performance that we've been experiencing now for decades, that began well before the Great Recession. It wasn't the Great Recession that started it. It had already started. Why was that going on? Now this chart, hopefully you can all read it. It's kind of a summary of what we found about the U.S. economy. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? Where are we gaining? Where are we losing? And what we see is that America has great strengths. Those are in the upper right-hand corner. But we are facing a growing array of alarming economic weaknesses, well known to all of you. Worker skills, eroding labor market flexibility, poor infrastructure, complex regulation, our legal system, an unsustainable federal budget, a corporate tax system that's still not fixed, and much more. Interestingly, if you look at this chart, you see that in the upper right-hand corner, which is where the strengths are, these are all areas that are really in the private sector. If you look in the lower left-hand quadrant, where all the weaknesses are and where we're getting worse, we see that those areas are almost universally the responsibility of government. And something's broken in our government because we can't seem to make progress on those weaknesses. When we asked our alumni about where they would put our political system on this chart, they put it where you see it. They identified the political system actually as our most significant economic problem and getting worse because it was blocking progress on dealing with these fundamental drivers of competitiveness in our economy. We then made a kind of a naive move. We created at HBS the 8-point plan, which was the most critical policy progress we needed to make in Washington if we were going to really jumpstart our economy again. And we made multiple trips to Washington and met many members of Congress. And virtually every single one we talked to said that our diagnosis is correct. This is right. And then they also said that they agreed with what needed to be done. We had to fix these things. But nothing got done. Now, our economic performance is concerning enough, but the deeper we dig here, the more the story gets worse. It's not just our economic performance. The economic agenda in a society is only half the job. We need to make progress on the social agenda if we are to make progress on the economic agenda. And on the social agenda, most of us start out with the idea that, we're doing pretty well. We've had a great history as a leader in social progress in America on many areas. And many of us think of ourselves as a leader compared to other countries in the world, but there's been no objective data to actually benchmark ourselves on this area. And so I led a group over a number of years that created this data, benchmarking data that would allow us to compare ourselves on many dimensions of social progress in America to many, many other countries. It was introduced in 2014. It's called the Social Progress Index for any of you that are interested. So let's take a look at how we're doing on the social agenda. And the answer is not good. Not good at all. This chart actually compares U.S. to the other OECD countries. These are the advanced economies in the world, and there's 36 of them. And based on the real data, you can see some of the key findings. You can see that on the question of maternal mortality, for example, which is down here in the lower left. We are actually 35th out of 36 OECD countries. Child mortality, 33, and so on. Homicide rate, 34. The U.S. has really fallen behind on moving the social agenda forward. We're sinking compared to other countries. And this is just a sample. There's much more that I could show you. And the conclusion is all the same. Not only are we not a leader in social progress anymore, but our social performance is actually declining. We're one of the few countries in the world where that's actually taking place based on our data. And this lack of progress on the social agenda is one of the key reasons why we're having economic problems. These things are synergistic, and unfortunately the synergism now is negative. Now, as a result of this work, we finally had the data to actually measure how our government is performing on the most important things we have to get done. This both frustrated me and also mystified me. How could this be? We know what we need to do. We know what we have to fix. We're a country that historically gets things done. That's been one of the uniquenesses of this country. How could we fix this? I didn't know. I had no idea. And what happened was that I knew Catherine. And Catherine had spent a significant period of her life really digging into the political system and the political system and the processes that it consists of. And she told me something that I really had a hard time swallowing. She said, there's absolutely no way that any of this is ever going to happen, changing these things. And no matter how many times I go to Washington, and no matter how many plans HBS puts forward, they're not going to work. And this was a difficult message to swallow, because we all hope that we can make progress. I, like many people, had made a fundamental mistake in thinking about the problem we're having. I, like many, thought we had a policy problem or a politician problem, the wrong people. And Catherine understood that actually what we really have is a political system problem. The system is designed so that it can't solve problems, and it won't solve problems. And then she had a real breakthrough idea, and a brilliant idea, which was that we could look at politics as an industry and look at how competition in that industry had evolved and emerged, and how that was really one of the root causes of what was actually going on in terms of what we do or don't get done. So I joined Catherine in this work in early 2016. I've now become obsessed with it. The reason is that it's so consequential. Imagine if these numbers don't change. Imagine if we continue to decline. What's going to happen to this great country? And so what I'd like to do is kind of hand it back over to Catherine and start to open up this question of why is this happening? What's causing our democracy not to be able to address these important problems? And so, Catherine, let me turn it over to you.
How many times have we heard Washington is broken? As my good friend Mickey Edwards originally explained, this saying represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. In fact, Washington is delivering exactly what it's currently designed to deliver. Now, how can our political system be so perfectly designed and yet deliver such dismal results? The answer is that it's not designed for us. In fact, the system has been designed and optimized over time for the benefit of private gain-seeking organizations, which are our two political parties, and their industry allies, which together comprise what we now call the political industrial complex. And our confusion, naturally, is that we've been assuming that the political system was designed to work for us. the citizens, the voters, the public interest. But the US political system doesn't really function how we think it functions. I'm going to give you two quick examples, and each time when we look under that proverbial hood, we'll see that the political system functions very differently than what most of us have assumed. So let's take an example first from elections. If you think back to when Joe Biden became vice president in 2009, his Senate seat was open in Delaware. And everybody in Delaware knew who was going to be the next senator from the state of Delaware, and that was Mike Castle. He's a multiple-term congressman, former governor, the most popular politician in the entire state. But you've never heard of Senator Mike Castle, because Mike Castle ran in his Republican primary, a low turnout election, and he lost in the Tea Party wave. Now, that really shouldn't have been a problem, because if he had some good strategic advice, you could say, well, it's just the primary. You know, get on the general election ballot. You're wildly popular. You'll absolutely win. But there was a slight problem in Delaware for Mike Castle, and that is that there is a relatively crazy law, and it's called the sore loser law. And what that says is if you run in your party's primary, Democrat or Republican, and you lose, you are not allowed to have your name on the general election ballot in November, no matter what people want. So a rational question to ask is, how many states in our democracy have a law like that? The answer is 44. And we're sitting in one today. Now, you may remember when Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman lost his Senate primary in 2006. But then he ran as an independent candidate on the general election ballot and got reelected, proving that that's who the voters of Connecticut wanted to serve them. The only reason Joe Lieberman could do that is because Connecticut was then one of only 4 states who didn't have a sore loser law. And there's a few other important things we all need to know about partisan primaries. They're publicly funded, but they're really for selection processes for private organizations. And primaries are the fundamental reason why so many people show up at the general election and think, I just don't really like these choices that I have. Because most elections are really decided in the primaries, especially in gerrymandered districts. And voters who turn out for partisan primaries tend to be more ideological than voters as a whole. And therefore, to make it through the primary, candidates have to go further to the right and further to the left than voters as a whole really want. But even more important than who gets elected and what they say during that process is that the influence of the partisan primary extends to heavily influence behavior in day-to-day legislating. Let me give you an example. You should imagine yourself as a politician, and you have an opportunity to pass a massive bipartisan compromise solution to one of those critical nation-wide problems that Michael identified earlier. The operative question that you have got to ask is not, is this a good idea? It's not, is this the right policy for the country? Is this what the majority of my constituents want? No, you have to ask one simple question. Am I going to be able to make it back through the eye of the needle that is my partisan primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that is no, then the answer to all the other questions are virtually wholly irrelevant, because the rational incentive to get reelected directs you to vote no. And if you do decide to go for it anyway, but the leadership of your party doesn't want you to vote yes, you can be threatened with a primary. Primary is not just a noun anymore. Some of you will recognize this. It's a verb, as in, we're going to primary you. And it means we're going to run someone further to your left if you're a Democrat, or further to your right if you're a Republican, and beat you in the primary. It never means we're going to run a more rational, consensus-oriented candidate to your middle. Partisan primaries combined with partisan gerrymandering are the key tools that the two parties, what we call the duopoly, use to control the political process. And it effectively moves our elected officials right and left and makes it impossible for them to tack back, And this makes it very difficult to govern, and we can start to understand why so little gets done in Washington, D.C. I want to give you a second example of our partisan system, and this one comes from D.C., from actual legislating. The duopoly also perverts legislation by controlling the legislative machinery. That's the day-to-day rules and practices of legislating. The Hastert Rule, which you'll recognize because it's named after our Illinois Speaker Denny Hastert, is a particularly egregious example of party control taking precedence over the legislature's ability to solve problems and to work collectively, even when constituents want it. So the Hastert Rule has become a well-accepted practice of all speakers of the House. The Speaker will not allow a floor vote on a bill unless the majority of the majority party, which is to say the Speaker's party, supports that bill, even if a majority of the entire House would vote to pass it. So unless speakers ignore that practice, which they do from time to time but rarely, even legislation supported by a majority of the country or a majority of the House has absolutely no chance of passing because there will never even be a vote. So I want to take you back 5 years ago. We're coming up to the anniversary of the 2013 government shutdown. That shutdown could have been entirely averted or ended earlier if then Speaker John Boehner had allowed a floor vote on legislation passed by the Senate and supported by a majority of the House, which is to say, virtually all of the Democrats and a minority of Republicans. And in fact, the shutdown ended only when the Speaker broke with his party and broke the Hastert Rule to allow the vote. Effectively, this made up, invented rule cements majority party control in a legislature that is supposed to represent all US citizens, and in this case, it allowed a small number of extreme partisans to hold the country hostage in a shutdown for 16 days. So let's think about it in all of our organizations, in your organizations. If you wanted to solve your biggest problems, I suspect that one thing you probably might not do is bring everybody together to work on that problem, but say, oh, just a moment before we start, let's count off by twos and divide into warring teams, and then we'll get right to work. But that's how it is every single day under the rules of the legislative machinery in Washington, D.C. It runs on a partisan basis. Our founders warned against political parties. As when John Adams said, "There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other." Clearly, politics doesn't work quite the way Schoolhouse Rock taught us that it did. I would sing that Bill song for you, except I'm really bad at that. My daughter made me promise I would tell you her favorite joke about the current situation. She's better at it than I am. So if con is the opposite of pro, then isn't Congress the opposite of progress? She'll be so happy. I'll let her know it did well. Okay, so the truth is, the US political system is not a public institution. It's a private industry and a classic duopoly. In the duopoly, the players advance their own interests instead of the public interest. And what's unique about the politics industry as compared with every other industry is that there's no independent regulation. The actors in the industry are the ones that themselves make up the rules of the game. Now, many of us have mistakenly assumed that the rules of the game are written in our Constitution, but for the most part, that's not true. It's short. That's why you can get that pocket version. It turns out that most of the rules that govern day-to-day behavior and incentives that drive legislation, or not, are set by the political industrial complex and for their benefit. As is always the case in life, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played and affect the outcomes of that game. And the net result of the rules of the game that have been constructed in the politics industry is unhealthy competition. And the result of unhealthy competition is always that customers are not well served. So thus, the actors in the political system are thriving. Go to Washington, D.C., you can feel it. And yet the American public has simply never been more dissatisfied. Just last fall, a new poll came out. 61% of Americans think that a major new third party is needed. And the percentage of Americans self-identifying as independent is at an all-time high of 43% just in July, versus only 29% saying Democrat and 25% saying Republican. As you guys know, in any other industry this big, this thriving, with this much consumer dissatisfaction, you would see a new entrant, probably led by someone from Kellogg, phenomenal entrepreneur, but I mean, maybe someone from HBS, because they realize it's a phenomenal business opportunity, and they would come in to deliver what the consumers in that industry really want. But that doesn't happen in politics, because as Michael's going to show you, the parties work really well together in one particular way, which is to rig the rules of the game to protect themselves from new competition. They erect huge barriers to entry. Put another way, politics isn't broken, it's fixed. In any other industry, we'd have a pretty good antitrust case. Sometimes we make this presentation, and if I don't put that in here, someone comes up after to say that's what we should do. But as you won't be surprised to know, ever so conveniently, antitrust regulation does not apply to the politics industry. And troublingly, there's no accountability for any of this, because the customer only has two choices. So the only thing each party has to do to win is to convince the average voter to choose them as the lesser of two evils, or to choose them because at least they say, therefore, what that voter believes. And what the parties don't have to do in this duopoly is to deliver results. Because no matter how disappointed you are, you probably still prefer what your side says therefore than what the other side says therefore. And therefore, instead of results in the public interest, we get gridlock. This chart shows the number of salient issues that are deadlocked in Congress. We reached a high of 74%. This is not the little stuff deadlocked, this is the big stuff. And when we do get something done, it's partisan. Take a look at this. A striking implication of the industry structure and how it's gotten a lot worse is shown here. Landmark legislation used to pass with bipartisan support. See the combination of red and blue votes for Social Security, highways, civil rights, Medicare, welfare reform? And then check out all blue for Affordable Care and Dodd-Frank, and all red for tax cuts. And now, when the other party takes power, they focus not on improving that legislation, but on repealing. This happens in part because there simply aren't many moderates left who can bridge the gap between the extremes of both sides. This slide shows the decline in moderates over time on both the Republican and Democrat sides, and everyone knows it's broken. This slide shows the dramatic decline in public trust in the federal government from 1958 to 2017. Now, as we said a moment ago, if competition in the political industry were healthy, industry actors would be competing to advance the public interest. And they would be held accountable for that. But that's not how it is. So the question is, why not? And for that, I'm going to turn it back to Michael.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, you can see the conundrum, the complexity of what's going on here, or most accurately, what's not going on. And to understand how and why this political competition that has been created diverges so sharply from the public interest, we now need to dig down into the tools that we use for analyzing competition. What drives competition? And here, those of you that are business school students, you've probably been exposed to the 5 forces. And this is a framework for looking at industries. And it's also really cool around when the new Star Wars movie comes out. In any event, what is the 5 forces framework? Well, essentially it says that an industry competition is kind of the interplay between the various actors. And there's some kinds of actors that are present in every industry. At the core of competition is the rivalry, the head-to-head rivalry between the competitors. In this case, the rivals are the Republicans and the Democrats. It's like Coke versus Pepsi. It's like General Mills, versus Kellogg's. And the nature of how these rivals compete is fundamental to the results that we see the industry delivering. But competition, as you see here, it's not just the rivals. There's also these surrounding actors that have often a profound influence on what competition looks like. There's, of course, the customers. That's us. We're citizens. We're customers. This is supposed to be delivering value for us. But as we'll see, all customers are not equal in the politics industry. We reach customers in this industry through various channels. You can see those here. Direct voter engagement, ground game, advertising, and so forth, the media, social media. And these are ways in which the parties, connect and deliver information to the voters. There's suppliers. In any industry, you need inputs, you need talent, you need resources to actually do the job of, in this case, running elections and governing. And we can see the key suppliers here. Not just candidates, but also campaign talent, people that are pollsters and so forth. Voter data. We have terribly sophisticated data now on everything about us voters because it allows the parties to be very efficient and very effective in how they kind of reach out to us. Think tanks who come up with ideas. And then lobbyists who are paid to go out and try to influence what happens in policy-making process. So that's another key actor. And then there's what we call the threat of new entrants. And the threat of new entrants are somebody that comes in to compete with the existing rivals, and that would be a new party. And the question we have to answer is, well, why hasn't there been a new party, given all the dysfunction that we see in the existing competition? And the answer to that is we've got to understand what are the barriers to entry. What makes it hard for a new party to get established? As we'll see, it's got to be hard because we haven't had a new party for well over 100 years that's been successful. And then finally, every industry has what we call substitutes. These are different ways of competing in the industry than the traditional way of competing. It's like Uber and taxis. And the substitutes are often the disruptors. And the question is, here, the most likely disruptor would be independents, people coming in and running as independents, not affiliating with a party. If we look at the industry this way and we see these actors and we see these influences, we can start to understand what's going on. So let's talk about that. It's a complicated competition. Understanding how the parties think and how they have chosen to compete is complicated. We'll focus here on some of the key dimensions, but we hope that you'll read a book that we're now getting well along on to get into the real nitty-gritty here, because we have to understand this really, really clearly if we're going to do anything about it. So the first thing we need to understand is the industry is a duopoly. Thank you. That was a nice suspense. So when you have a duopoly, that means there's two and only two dominant competitors. And that has a huge impact on the way the competition takes place. It's much different than if there were more competitors. The most important customers in the politics industry are not the average voter. It's very hard to take as an average voter. Why? Well, in any industry, savvy competitors find the most profitable customers, the ones that deliver them or give them the most benefit. And in politics, of course, value for the parties is reliable votes, people that show up and vote for the party's side of the game, and then money, of course, because this is a very high cost industry these days. Billions of dollars are spent in this industry. Instead of average voters, the core customers here are partisan primary voters. From listening to Catherine, you know why. And special interests. People that care fundamentally and deeply about some issue, whether it's public education or whether it's X, Y, and Z, and are very, very committed to getting their way on that particular issue. The parties focus the vast majority of their attention on serving these two groups, the partisan primary voters and the special interests. And because the voters only have these two choices, as Catherine mentioned, the duopoly doesn't actually have to deliver any results to the average voter to win elections and say in a duopoly. Essentially, they take the average voter in the general election for granted, and if you don't vote, you're virtually ignored. The duopoly in this competition is free to focus on these core customers. The partisan primary voters and the special interests that are aligned with their ideological stance. Now that leads to the next really critical thing to understand, and that is that political competition today certainly is not based on solving problems. It's based on ideology. The party wants to do things that will align with their ideological stance. And what we know is that ideology is a cartoon. It's too simple. It's a stylized view of the world. It's not the real world. Real solutions to real problems are not simple. It's not big government versus small government. It's much more complicated than that. And yet, the competition today is much more about being on the ideological side that you want to come out on as opposed to whether we actually solve the problem. And the parties have created this idea that there's this choice between big government and small government or regulation and no regulation. These are false choices. It's not that simple. It's somewhere in between. It involves its complexity and in many cases compromise. This partisan competition that I'm describing, which is about getting it our way rather than the way that works, is really reinforced by the fact that the parties now control the key suppliers and the key channels for reaching voters. Campaign consultants today are either Democrat or Republican campaign consultants. If you work on a Republican campaign, you will never, ever in all of history work on a Democratic campaign. You're locked into one side or the other. The same is true in the media increasingly. You're locked into this set of media or that set of media, and the media are locked into you. And what we have is these two sort of diametrically different camps facing off against each other and struggling essentially to have things fit their view of the world as opposed to the view of the world that's more complicated and more realistic and it might actually matter. The final point here I want to make is that despite the failure to deliver results, progress on all those issues we talked about earlier, there is no new competition. The parties primarily, by themselves, deliberately have created very high barriers to entry that make it very hard for a new party or even independent to get a foot in the ground. These are incumbency advantages, as we say in business, brand, tradition, and so forth, economies of scale. Parties are running campaigns all across the country And there's real efficiencies that a new party or an independent is really up against a huge barrier. The parties control the talent. They control the channels. It's hard for a new competitor to even get taken seriously by the media and hire a campaign staff. And just as an example of that, you might be interested to know that the duopoly created a rule on fundraising that allows a single donor to contribute $847,500 annually, every year, to a national political party. But if you're an independent, the rule says you can only get $5,400 per election cycle, and that's 2 years. Okay? This is a completely made-up rule. And as Catherine said, the parties are very good at collaborating on making up these rules that benefit them. And therefore, we don't see a new party. We have had no new party in this country since 1854. And independents have a tremendous struggle working their way through this labyrinth of barriers that have been created. Now, let me conclude my part of discussing this competition by hopefully not depressing you too much more, but it's depressing. What are the outcomes that we get here, and why? And the first one is the parties actually don't want to solve these problems. They'd rather have them persist. If they solve immigration, if we solve gun control, just think of what the loyalists think. And the loyalists they don't want to solve it. They want their way. And as long as the issue is unsettled and unsolved, the parties get tremendous support from their core customers. The parties energize their core customers really by not getting anything done. It's perverse, but it's very smart if you're a party and you're trying to maximize your benefit. Political dysfunction is not only on legislation now, but the parties have been able to spread partisanship to our independent regulatory agencies, to our executive agencies, where to get an important position in government now, civil service, that's old school. Now you got to be a partisan. You got to be loyal to the party. Even the courts now have been infiltrated by partisanship, because a nominee to the Supreme Court or some other court has to be a loyal partisan even to get that nomination anymore. And so this partisanship is spread beyond just the legislation, and it affects everything that we need our political system to do. And then I think the final thing that we have to understand, we just have to understand this, is that there are no countervailing forces building that are going to restore this healthy competition. It's wired into the rules. It's wired into the reality of the nature of this competition, and there's only one way it's going to change. And that's us. Now, to talk about how we might do that, and there are ways to do that, and it is starting to happen, let me turn it back over to Catherine to talk about what we need to do if we're actually going to change this mess we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Michael. We are almost to the optimistic part. Not quite, though, because I have a story for you. So 2 young fish are swimming along, and they meet another fish coming the other way, who says to them, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" They swim along a little bit further, and one of them looks at the other finally and says, "What the hell is water?" And the point of this story is it's easy to forget that what surrounds you seems normal only because it's usual. And to others, these surroundings might actually seem rather strange, and our political system is to us like water to the fish. We think it's normal, that this dysfunction is to be expected, and therefore we complain about it, but we don't fundamentally question the system because we actually don't really think it's possible to change. We think it's normal that in 2010, Mitch McConnell, then Senate Minority Leader, says his top priority is to make Obama a one-term president, and Nancy Pelosi, when she became Speaker of the House the time before, says her top priority is to elect more Democrats. We think it's normal that Speaker Paul Ryan, before he retired last year, said, and I quote, Both left and right play on people's division and exploit their frustrations for political gain, not good. All this just to get a coalition that's 50% plus one. We think it's normal that both parties in turn have killed bipartisan immigration deals for political calculus, and we think it's normal that $1 billion is invested in a lobbying index of companies that get the most bang for their lobbying buck, and this index has, over the past decade, outperformed the S&P 500 by almost 5 percentage points annually. We think it's normal that the richest country in the world had its credit downgraded because of partisan political gamesmanship. And we think it's normal that you can donate that 313 times more money to a Republican or a Democrat than an independent candidate. We think it's normal that only Republicans or Democrats can be on a presidential debate stage, no independents. We think it's normal that when researchers at Princeton and Northwestern University examined congressional action on 1,179 policy issues, they found, and I quote, "When the preferences of economic elites and organized interest groups are accounted for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically insignificant impact on public policy." It always gets me. We think it's normal to have only two choices, and we think it's normal not to like any of them. And all of this seems normal because it's usual, but let me be clear. We should see the water we're in, and we should be absolutely outraged. No way to run a country. But the good news is that it really doesn't have to be like this. Political innovation, which is the lifeblood of any economy and industry innovation, political innovation can save us. So let's summarize the theory of change. In any game, board game, sports game, serious game like politics, you change the rules of the game and you change the behavior and you change the outcomes. Most of the rules aren't in the Constitution. It's a pocket Constitution. It's this big. They're made up. Our work has a comprehensive reform strategy with 4 pillars. But today, I want to talk about only the first of those because it's the highest priority and it's available to us to make this change much sooner than you might think. And we must absolutely re-engineer the elections machinery. For this, I've got to back up a moment and tell you quickly about the key structural problems in our existing elections. First, partisan primaries we talked about. So that creates the eye of the needle problems through which no problem-solving politician can pass, and they've got to keep their eye on their ideological far wing. The second, which we haven't talked about yet, is plurality voting. So in the US, elections can be won with only a plurality of the votes. So the winner has the most votes, but not necessarily a true majority. For example, in three-way race, you can win with 34%. You won, but 66% of the voters in that race preferred someone else. Plurality voting, it turns out, is an enormous barrier to new competition for 2 reasons. First, there's the spoiler argument. So sometimes we don't vote for the candidate we really want out of fear that our vote will inadvertently help elect the candidate that we like the least. For example, in 2016, you may not vote for Jill Stein because you will take votes away from Hillary and inadvertently help elect Trump. You also may not vote for Gary Johnson because you'll take votes away from Trump and help elect Hillary. And currently, you also can't even begin to think about voting for Howard Schultz. And not only that, Howard Schultz, who's exploring an independent run for president, you're not only not supposed to vote for him, he's not supposed to have the right to run. Politics is the only industry that claims that less competition is actually good for the consumer. And this, to me, begs the question of how could you spoil a system that is already rotten? The other problem with plurality voting is wasted votes. So there's spoiler problem, then there's wasted votes, which is to say, even if you're not spoiling because your candidate has no chance of winning, you're wasting your vote. These 2 problems, partisan primaries and plurality voting, are a key reason why we don't have healthy competition. They're the reason why most potential new competition never makes it to the starting line. They have a few meetings with political consultants, they understand the dynamics, and they're out before they're in. The two elections innovations that we propose, when implemented together as a package, solve these problems. And they fundamentally change what politicians are incented to do. Elections machinery reform, number one, is to institute what we call 4 forward primaries. And here's how that works. We eliminate the partisan primaries where we vote only in the Democrat or the Republican primary. And instead, when you go to the primary, there's only one ballot. Every candidate, no matter their affiliation, Democrat, Republican, Independent, is all on the same ballot. So you're not voting the Democrat primary or the Republican primary, you're in this nonpartisan primary. And the top 4 finishers out of that primary automatically advance to the general election. 4 forward primaries eliminate the eye of the needle primary problem and allow legislators significantly more leeway to legislate in the public interest. Combine that with election machinery reform number 2, which is to institute ranked choice voting in general elections. And here's how that works. So now the top 4 finishers from the 4 forward primary are on the ballot. And now I show up at my election and I see my 4 choices, and it's very easy. I pick my favorite, just like always. But then if I want to, I can also pick my second choice, my third choice, and my last choice. I can rank as many or as few as I want. So here's my ballot in a ranked choice election. I like the musical, so I'm picking Alexander Hamilton. And then George is my second choice, Thomas Jefferson my third, and I'm not a James Madison fan, apparently, so he's my last choice. The polls close. The first place votes are counted. And if a candidate has a majority, a true majority, over 50%, the election is over and that candidate wins. But if the leader falls short of 50% plus 1, then technology enables instant runoff voting. And the last place candidate is automatically eliminated. And if I voted for that candidate who's now out, my second choice is counted instead. The votes are now counted again, and the process continues until you have a true majority winner. So it's basically a series of runoffs, but instead of having to keep coming back for another election, you cast all your votes at once. Ranked choice voting eliminates both the spoiler problem and the wasted vote argument and ensures that we always elect the candidate with the broadest appeal to the most number of voters. And these are not, by the way, crazy new ideas. Australia's voted this way for over a century. And back in 2002, Alaska had a referendum on the ballot to implement ranked choice voting. And at that time, a famous politician recorded a robocall in support. Let's listen.
Hello, this is Senator John McCain. I'm calling to urge your support for ballot measure 1 on August 27th. As a presidential candidate and as a senator, I've worked hard to open up the political process for all Americans. Ballot measure 1 will adopt a fairer voting method. It will lead to good government because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters. Please vote yes on measure 1 on August 27th.
And also in 2002, Illinois Senate Bill 1789 proposed ranked choice voting for their congressional and statewide primaries. The sponsor, then State Senator Barack Obama. John McCain, Barack Obama, 2 talented politicians and devoted public servants who knew how the game is played. They were ahead of their time on these reforms, but now that time has come. And together, these reforms, open top 4 primaries and ranked choice voting, will powerfully alter incentives. So let's go back and reimagine Congress post-election machinery reform. Now, when a member of Congress is presented with that same opportunity to sign the big bipartisan compromise legislation, they can vote yes if it's in the public interest. They can say, oh, well, under the old system, I never would have made it back through my primary, but I'm pretty sure that I can be in the top 4. I'm the incumbent, I'm popular, I'm known. I'll be in the top 4. And then in the general election, with a combination of first and second place votes together, I will be able to craft a win. So elected officials now owe their election to a broader group of voters and are incented to be responsive to the entire district, not to a narrow swath of primary voters and special interests. And additionally, the existing incentives for scorched earth campaigning are reduced. Most importantly, the barriers to entry are dramatically lower for new competition, leading to healthy competition to serve the public interest. Let's go quickly back to our Venn diagrams. Remember this one? Under the current rules of the game, there's no intersection, no connection between acting in the public interest and the likelihood of getting reelected. After we implement these election machinery reforms, we see a different diagram. Here it is with the solution. We implement 4 forward primaries, ranked choice voting general, and create that intersection. And then actors in the politics industry are incented to do what we as a country actually need them to do. And that is the true power of political innovation. 3 things I want to talk about. We need to implement state campaigns. There'll be either legislative campaigns or referendum campaigns to implement these election reforms. The Constitution delegates almost everything about the elections to each individual state, which is why, during presidential primaries, you see everything looking so different state by state. So each state has to change these rules individually. 26 states can accomplish this through a binding referendum, and 24 states need to have legislative action, so a bill signed by the governor, which is the case, for example, in my home state now, Wisconsin, and in Illinois. These efforts are in the works at an early stage in other states. Maine passed ranked choice voting by referendum on June 12th, not even a couple months ago. I actually woke my daughter up at midnight at her request to tell her that it passed, because she knew, because I told her, she's still young enough to listen to me, that this was the most consequential election in her lifetime to date, because of where we could go with that as a country. California and Washington have implemented open top 2 primaries through referendum. They should move to top 4. You might see that begin to be advocated for. And in Wisconsin, my home state now, we're just getting started, and we have a bipartisan leadership group that started in a room exactly like this. And we have, for example, in our bipartisan group, we have the single largest progressive funder in our state. And we have the CEO of a tech company who held a fundraiser in his home for President Trump in the 2016 season. And they got up behind the podium at our event, one's like short and tall, and said, "We don't agree on anything, but we agree on this." And we have come together across the ideological spectrum to say, these are the rules under which we want to play this game for the good of our country. The second thing we have to do is advocacy. So we have to get the message out and get a critical mass of focus on the most powerful innovations. People need to know that we can change this and how we can change it. And our state legislators and governors will need to know that we want this done. I think you in Illinois do know how this works. They say they'll see the light when they feel the heat. And that is our job. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." And the thing is that it doesn't bend by itself. We bend it. And our hope today is that there will be people in this room who decide to engage powerfully in moving these reforms forward and come together and form an effort in Illinois to demand these election reforms out of Springfield. The final thing that we need to do, oh, good. Oh, that seemed pretty good. Okay, so let me say then, take the opportunity to say there are cards on your table. If you'll fill them out, you can get more information, but there's also a checkbox where you say that you would be interested in engaging with an Illinois-specific effort. There are some people here who have indicated a willingness to get all of those names and be part of convening any of you who are interested. So please grab those cards and fill them out. Additionally, there are some cards there for questions. We may have time for a couple. They're the blank cards. If you have any questions, or we'll take comments, you could fill those out, and somehow it works that people will be around to collect them. Now let's move back to this. Here's the third thing we need to do. And this really matters. We have to allocate capital. America has a great philanthropic tradition. Over $390 billion is donated annually to charitable causes. But we really do owe it to ourselves to put that $390 billion in perspective. That is the number that federal and state governments combined spend in 2.5 weeks. Philanthropy is simply no substitute for effective government. Bill and Melinda Gates have recognized this. They've said, a quote, "One of the first lessons we learned when we started our foundation was a humbling one. Our resources are only a drop in the bucket compared with the needs around the world," and here's the important point, "and only a small percentage of what governments spend each year to help meet those needs. For example, California spends more than our entire endowment to run its public school system for just 1 year. And that's the largest foundation in the world. So traditional philanthropy will neither end poverty nor solve the United States' most pressing problems. For that, we need effective state, federal, and local governments, and a bit of economic growth would be good too. Investment in transforming the effectiveness of government offers the best potential ROI by orders of magnitude of any potential philanthropic investment out there. Transforming government is the best way, and in many cases, the only way to scalably affect pretty much everything, every issue we care about, including healthcare, education, poverty, our economic competitiveness, job growth, future prospects for the country. David Crane, who's the founder of a fabulous organization called Govern for California, coined this term political philanthropy, and he calls it a special interest for the general interest. Now, how much money is there in this fabulous special interest for the general interest? Well, our early analysis that we're doing at HBS indicates that the organizations that are working on political reform collectively have combined annual revenues of just over $226 million only, and total employment of only 1,800 people. The specific election innovations that I just proposed attracted last year only $8 million of investment across the entire country. Essentially, the political innovation industry is in startup phase. So you may not get the return of an early Silicon Valley investment, but this industry of innovation in our democracy is crying out for the investment of people in this room. And it's a huge opportunity for both political philanthropists and political entrepreneurs to get in at the ground floor. Now is the time for concerned donors to redirect a portion of, or even all, of their philanthropic giving into this political innovation. So finally, in closing, historically, the American political system was a critical foundation of the United States' success. But today, it stands in the way of almost every important issue that we need to address. But at the same time, America is a truly great country. You might have heard about a year ago John McCain's remarks last fall when he was accepting the Liberty Medal Award from the National Constitution Center. And he described our country as this: big, boisterous, sprawling, temperate, striving, daring, beautiful, bountiful, brave, magnificent country. And I am with him on that. But we are also crystal clear about the challenges we face. And that's why I want to close with this invitation to action. So Thomas Jefferson said, or actually he's said to have said, I have an HBS fact checker who tells me he didn't really say it, but he should have. We don't have an American government by the majority. We have a government by the majority who participate. And historically, at least for me, I thought that meant I had to participate by voting. But it turns out that what it really means is we also have to participate by being actively engaged in overseeing the rules of the game of our political system. So remember Benjamin Franklin? This is probably what he was getting at when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention and a woman asked him, "So what have you given us, Mr. Franklin, a republic or a monarchy?" And Benjamin Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Reclaiming the promise of our republic, the promise of the American experiment, is simply the challenge of our times. And we can do this. I look forward to engaging with any and all of you on it. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming.